Welcome everyone in the room, everyone on Zoom. My name is Shane Phillips. I am the Housing Initiative Manager for the UCLA Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies. And today we have our guests here to talk about building circulation reform and infill housing. I understand there was a push to name it Single Stairway to Heaven. And I personally regret that that decision was not made. But this talk is about building design and how I think seemingly small rules and standards can have pretty big impacts on the cost, sustainability, comfort, aesthetic appeal, all these things of the housing that we build. I'm sure there are other benefits that our guests will talk about as well. These are reforms that would make housing better and more affordable today. But I think in large part, this is about looking ahead. And one of the biggest barriers to building low-cost housing really all over the country, but certainly in LA as well, and especially in more opportunity and rich and affluent neighborhoods, is zoning that makes it illegal to build multifamily housing in most places. Also rules like minimum parking mandates and height limits and a laundry list of other things. But as we reform those rules, as those dominoes continue to fall, as they have been, especially at the state level here in California, the other weaknesses and flaws and things we hadn't really thought about or might have been overlooked in our housing policy, in our building codes and elsewhere are going to become more obvious. They're going to become more salient. And so by starting to think about these seriously now, things like building codes in general and single stairway reform in particular, we can put ourselves in a position, I hope, for zoning reform, parking reform, public and social housing projects, and other reforms and policies and programs to have the most and best possible impact. So that's what we're going to be talking about. Advance here. I want to make sure we start here with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge the Gabrielino Tongva peoples as the traditional caretakers of Tovangar. As a land grant institution, we pay our respects to the ancestors, elders, and relatives relations, past, present, and emerging. Our speakers today are Ed Mendoza, Policy Director of the Livable Communities Initiative, Emily Hamilton, Senior Research Fellow for the Mercatus Center, and she's going to be joining us virtually, Nolan Gray, doctoral student here at UCLA and Research Director for California YIMBY, and Alex Fish, Council Member for the City of Culver City. I also am taking this opportunity to encourage people to subscribe to the Housing Voice podcast. If you are the type of person who is interested in hearing about single stair building code reform, you may very well be the kind of person who will enjoy listening to hour-long episodes where we talk to researchers about things like inclusionary zoning, minimum lot size reform. Those were a couple topics that some of our panelists here spoke about, as well as social housing in France, public housing in Singapore, family-friendly housing in Vancouver, et cetera, et cetera. So please do check that out. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ed as our first speaker. I'll load up your slides here. Thank you. Move this out of the way. And just let me know when to move forward.
For sure. So before I start, I want to give a big, but I mean big shout out to Mike Eliason, because if it wasn't for him, I wouldn't have become aware of these issues outside the conventional land use and planning world. So thank you. And hopefully I'm okay at explaining what you explained to all of us who have become stair-pilled. So let's begin. Building code affects the way buildings are designed and who could afford to develop them. Today, we're going to investigate one specific code and type of building. I'm going to be speaking on point access block, single stair, and vertical shared access circulation. All these terms meaning the same exact thing. There's still no consensus on what to call this type of circulation yet, so we're working on it. But I'm going to be using these terms interchangeably. Next slide. So what is it? Vertical shared access is a building layout that involves having a vertical structural core, most likely composed of an elevator and a stairwell that leads into units. Unlike what the colloquial single stair name may suggest, this layout is much less about stairs, but rather circulation inside of a building. It's about how people get in and out and move around to enter and exit units in a building. Vertical shared access layouts are in many ways better than what we build today. And that is because they allow for one, more housing. You could build on any type of parcel size. Two, you could build any type of unit layout. Three, they're the most efficient with buildable layout. They're better housing. They're better with ADA access. You can move to and from to your unit from the outside easily. They're quieter buildings with more sunlight, with cross ventilation and airflow. And they're good with elevators on small parcels. And lastly, they're easier to build because building constraints are lessened. You're able to build just about anywhere. And it's faster because you could standardize building. Next slide. So these are the typical floor plans of this type of circulation setup. Highlighted is a core consisting of stairs and an elevator. Notice that there are almost no corridors, and even the longest corridor out of these diagrams does not run the length of the building. All units feed off to the core. Next slide. So after all this praise, why don't we have this? So in California and most of the US, we have something called the second egress requirement. What it says is that units in multifamily buildings must have two ways of entering and exiting a building. We also have another requirement that says that both ways must be through staircases. Though this requirement sounds innocuous and uneventful to building, far from it. Next slide. The second egress requirement heavily influences how we build multifamily buildings in the US. It incentivizes large or full block buildings. It promotes thick bread loaf style buildings that utilize double loaded corridor setups. So think hotel corridors on large sites and motel style gallery access corridors on smaller sites. So like think a motel. Having these forms of corridors then leads to units that motels and hotels produce, slot style homes that usually fall into studios or one bedrooms. These configurations have also started a current trend of windowless bedrooms in new developments. Typically, larger units could be built in these layouts, but they're often reserved as corner units, as overall larger units are much less efficient in floor space usage compared to one beds and studios. So naturally, less are built. Next slide. So this is how they look like. To the left is a double loaded corridor setup seen in most multifamily buildings, think like a hotel. And on the right, we have vertical core with an elevator and a stair wrapping an elevator leading directly to units. You see this a lot in Europe or Latin America or in Asia, pretty much anywhere that is not the United States. Next slide. On the left, we have some typical 5/1 block site developments. You can see that they're much wider than their European counterparts to the right. And what we end up getting in American building is less open space with very minimal advantages regarding density, as both layouts, left and right, are about the same size and same density. Next slide. So this is the meaty part. Here are circulation layouts. On the left, we have a gallery style access. Most common in motels and mid-century buildings, they are very inefficient in space utilization, and they're limited to how tall they can go. In the middle, we have double-loaded corridors. These are the most common in American development. However, they usually require the most space to be built. Having a large site is all but mandatory, as you need to accommodate side-by-side units and a hallway with stairs and elevators. So think sites that are wider than 50 feet, and this is noting that most standard parcels in any typical city are less than 50 feet. So this makes land assembly common, and land assembly is expensive. In Los Angeles, land assembly increases land costs by 15 to 40%. A $1 million parcel sells for $1.4 million if you want to assemble two parcels side by side. Units in this setup also get too much light or too little light because there's only one side of a unit that gets sunlight. You also get an overproduction of one beds and studios, like I previously mentioned, and they also are pretty terrible with acoustic privacy, as bedrooms and living rooms can't really be designed to be too far from your adjacent neighbor. You're right next to them. On the right, we have a single core layout, and there's a reason that this layout is the favorite within the international community. One, it's the most efficient in terms of floor space usage. Two, units can be built to have cross ventilation, have windows on many sides to get sunlight, and you get air and the whole package. And three, acoustic privacy. You could get acoustic privacy because architects have the freedom to build however they want, because they're not limited by a hallway, right? And next slide. So this is how it looks like. I kind of drew it, looks kind of bad, but the blue is air, the gold is sunlight. You can see on the left that air flows all through the apartment. To the right, you only get through one side. And then to the far right, you have how units look on the double loaded corridor setup. I don't know if you could tell, but These units have bedrooms without windows in them. Okay, next slide. Okay, so safety. So if it's so good, then why don't we have it? It must be unsafe. I mean, there has to be a reason why, right? Well, having a second egress requirement is a bit of a historical fluke. After World War II, insurance companies wanted to underwrite the mass construction of multifamily buildings nationwide for returning GIs. Companies chose the 1902 New York City Fire Code to base their model after New York had a pretty good record on fire safety, as the city hadn't had a major urban conflagration since the mid-1800s. They copied and pasted their building code, and the code had a second egress requirement. Note that this really didn't have much correlation to why New York buildings didn't catch on fire. Most buildings in New York were masonry built, and they've been masonry built since the mid-1800s. So they just did it. So regional codes then copied insurance companies in the 1960s, and in the late 1990s, the IBC adopted the regional codes, and second egress requirements were never changed or substantially modified. All of this is to say that we don't fight fires the same way that we did in 1860 or 1902. We have modern sprinkler systems, fire-treated timber, pressurized stairwells, and even our furniture is fire-treated nowadays. The way we fight fires has evolved in some aspects in our code, but our second staircase requirement never evolved. In vertical core setups, second means of egress still remains, but it's not as a second internal staircase. Second egresses utilize fire escapes, non-stair methods such as fire ladder truck egresses through windows, etc. But universally, second egress requirements come with improved fire mitigations in buildings, and often better than mitigations that we see in the United States. Next slide. Oh, believe it or not, vertical core buildings are legal in some American cities today. Seattle and, ironically, New York. They all have their own set of safety standards and mitigations. Seattle, for example, allows up to 6 stories, and they do pressurized stairwells, etc. And they get it built, and they seem to be fine with it. Next slide. So on an international level, the US, Canada, Nigeria are the only countries that have second egress requirements with stairwells. Countries around the world have different standards. Spain and Austria allow 10 stories, New York 6, Netherlands 5, depends on the country and the region. Next slide. Okay, so let's bring it back a little bit. Why am I even asking for this? Or why are we even talking about this? Well, egress and stairway requirements have a profound effect on what gets built and what doesn't get built in our neighborhoods. Builders that focus on large sites that are half an acre don't really see an immediate advantage to vertical core circulation because their pro formas are set up to take the impact of whatever inefficiencies hallways may bring to a project. This cannot be said for smaller developers. Current stairway requirements may eat up to a third of livable, developable space in a project. And a study in Virginia studying these effects saw a $60,000 per unit cost in having a second stairway requirement for small developments. Just like mandatory on-site parking, second stair requirements may kill the feasibility of small projects. Next slide. So who builds today? Well-capitalized developers that could afford the cost of land assembly and any cost and efficiency that contemporary building brings. So think big buildings that you close your eyes, you've seen them. Who can't build? Small developers trying to move up the value chain from building ADUs to fourplexes, homeowners or small property owners that want to build something on their lot or multifamily on their lot, or community land trusts or cooperatives that do not have the same funding or may be limited to how much land they own, as opposed to traditional, larger nonprofit affordable housing developers that usually tend to develop projects over 50 units and utilize tax credits. Next slide. All right, so this is the lightning section. So this is a commercial main street lined with, this is Culver City. This is a typical commercial main street in Culver City with small commercial parcels. Today, you can't build here you can't build anything. It's really hard to assemble the land. But we have hundreds of these parcels, or thousands of these parcels in Culver City. And we have tens of thousands of these parcels throughout California, if not more. Next slide. With vertical core reform, we could have any size lot turn into potential affordable housing. Any size lot. Next slide. Here are some layouts of how they look like inside. To the right is a social housing development, 12 units in Paris with only 24 feet width. Next slide. This is co-housing in Seattle. Next slide. And this is to the left is Seattle, to the right is Paris. So this is very typical of what we build today. We just can't build it here. Next slide. This is Culver City again. Culver City, that's the move Culver City, which is super great with their bus lanes and the protected bike lanes. They still can't build the housing. Next slide. That's how it looked like with housing. Woo, looks nice, right? Next slide. All right. So this is a little bit more nefarious part. And this is a strange side effect of second stairway requirements. Some developers actually try to avoid them altogether. To the left is a fourplex development that is 3 stories tall and has 2,000 square foot units with 4 to 5 bedrooms apiece. Units rent for $4,000 to $5,000. But the catch is usually these units are rented out by the bedroom at $900 to $1,100. Smaller developers will build these substandard structures to get around building code, usually utilizing the R1 and R2 residential. So usually building code meant for very small developments on projects that contain, up to 20 families. This is a detriment to ADA accessibility. These buildings have weaker fire and life safety standards, and most importantly, or within the whole thing, they lack affordable housing. Next slide. Better funded developers who try to, build, the good way, I guess, are also limited to what they could build on small sites. As you could see, to the left, it looks kind of no windows, right? You know what's behind those windows? A staircase and a corridor. About a third or half of the buildings are just wasted just because of our building code. Crazy, right? Next slide. I keep on talking about small construction. Mike Eliason in Large Lab conducted a fascinating study on larger developments utilizing this form of egress circulation. I invite you to check it out. And they found that this works perfectly fine and is, cost saving. It produces better units, the whole thing on larger units as well. So this could also apply to very large affordable housing tax credit projects. And it's if right now, as everyone knows, they're really expensive to build. We could get them to be built cheaper. Next slide. And lastly, right now, we are not building enough housing for all people. We are kind of focusing on a very small niche. And I don't know if it's on purpose or not, but this has to end. We have to be able to expand how we build housing and the types of housing that we build. And it's good for climate, it's good for society, and it's good for equity's sakes.
Okay. Thank you, Ed. And Emily, I think you are up next. I'm going to stop sharing and let you share your screen. Hopefully everything goes okay here.
Perfect. All right, all good?
Yep, we can see it.
Okay, thanks so much, Shane, and to the UCLA Lewis Center for hosting this discussion, and to everyone joining this afternoon. I'm going to talk a little bit about the proposal under consideration in Virginia to implement this single stair reform, again, based on the work of Mike Eliason, who Ed mentioned, as well as Conrad Ecker, 2 architects who have been really influential in spreading the unusual case of the second egress requirement in the US and Canada, and who have really started this discussion. Lyle Sola-Yates and Rory Stolzenberg, 2 members of the Planning Commission in Charlottesville, Virginia, really initiated this discussion here in the state following the work that they did to implement a new comprehensive plan in Charlottesville. And I saw that Lyle is watching the discussion this afternoon, so perhaps he can join in with some updates from the latest policy developments in Virginia, but I'll be covering that background. So the Charlottesville comprehensive plan basically implemented this new kind of beige area of medium intensity residential, as well as many changes, but this is the one where it seems to me where the single stair reform would have the biggest effect, because this new designation within the comp plan allows for development up to 4 stories or and 12 units per lot, which, if we think about it, is just a really difficult configuration to achieve with the second egress requirement. You're not really going to be able to build a feasible building that includes 4 stories and 12 units, as well as 2 staircases with a corridor connecting those. Your entire building is going to be eaten up with circulation, and it's going to be very inefficient. But with a single stair component or alternative, we can imagine a floor plan for each floor that would look something like this one, with, in this example, 3 2-bedroom units per floor connected by a very small corridor here and a single staircase. And in this case, it's a walk up, but we could also imagine an elevator building with the staircase surrounding the elevator, like we saw in some of the lovely images that Ed showed. In the Virginia discussion, the primary consideration that is being considered against the move to the single stair plus an external fire escape option for buildings up to 6 stories is coming from the Virginia Department of Fire Programs. And it's really, really important to consider fire safety anytime we are talking about changes to the building code, including fire safety professionals, architects, and code consultants in that discussion. But just looking at raw statistics, it's very clear that the US is not doing great in terms of fire safety as a result of the 2 egress requirement that, again, as Ed said, has been common in the US for the past century. So for every 100,000 people in a typical year, the US sees about 1 death as a result of a fire, which is twice the rate of some countries that are famous for permitting single stair development, including the United Kingdom, Austria, Germany, and Switzerland here. Economists, because of the safety concerns, when we're talking about code reform, economists and other academics who touch on the land use regulation and housing affordable space have been very hesitant to get involved in any building code issues. Alain Berteau, who many of you may be familiar with his work, he's an urban planner who straddles the planning and economic housing economic space. He has advocated a research agenda that focuses on reforming barriers to lower cost construction that a typical consumer can readily evaluate with their own eyes. So things like unit size or building height, or layout, things that anyone who's casually looking at a housing unit can assess. When we're talking about code reforms, we are outside of this space. This is a space where we very much need safety professionals to be involved, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be considering both the benefits and the costs of current regulations. And as we can see from this very simplistic chart, it's not the case that the second egress requirement in the US is leading to good fire safety outcomes. So I think it's definitely an area where US professionals should be open to learning from their counterparts in Europe and other parts of the world where lower cost buildings are made feasible and fire safety outcomes are higher. Thanks a lot, and I'll turn it over to the next speaker.
Thank you, Emily. going to just share the main screen here again one more time. There we go. This is not the right screen. There we go. I think Nolan, you're up next.
Yeah, I'm up. So first, thanks to the Lewis Center for having me. Thanks to everyone for coming out. I'm impressed by how many people are voluntarily here to talk about building code reform. We did bribe you with food, but the Zoom people are.
You got another 100 on the Zoom, yeah.
So especially the Zoom, everyone here is just here to eat food. The Zoom people are really my people. But seriously, thanks for coming out. I think this is how many folks here are doing a master's in city planning or a master's in public policy? Any PhD students? Any PhD students, brother? You can raise your hand on the Zoom, by the way. I think this is actually probably one of the next big, exciting research and policy reform spaces in land use planning and housing affordability. We're in a pretty good place now on zoning. Of course, if you know anything about me, zoning is my bread and butter. Wrote a book on zoning. We're in a pretty good place on zoning reform and the barriers that out-of-date zoning regulations pose for new housing production. But we're really just scratching the surface on a whole host of other inherited frameworks that still stand in the way of affordable housing production. Thinking about how we do preservation well, how we do environmental protection right, how we do subdivision regulation in a smart way. And then of course, what we're here to talk about today, which is building code rules. In a certain sense, it's never been easier, at least as of last month, it's never been easier to build multifamily infill in California. Of course, some of you may have heard Governor Gavin Newsom signed AB 2011 into law just recently, allowing low and mid-rise multifamily along commercial corridors. So it's now legal to take those half-empty strip malls or probably permanently empty office parks and turn those into the mixed income multifamily housing that our state needs. We've removed certain regulatory barriers that often threaten small multifamily infill like parking requirements. So AB 2097 was passed into law, exempting projects within a half mile of transit from parking requirements. So we've got a lot of the regulatory framework there to allow for the type of small multifamily infill that our state needs to once again be affordable and equitable and sustainable. But we still have a lot of these building code rules, as Ed, I think so eloquently described, that stand in the way of some of this infill. So what can we do here? I think there's a few avenues for reform that we can take. The first, of course, is that local governments can amend their local building codes and allow allow developers to build single stair structures pursuant to maybe heightened fire standards that you see in other countries, right? So of course, here in the US, Seattle has already done this, and we're already seeing some of the fantastic projects. I love the, what was it, Capitol Core, the 6-story project. I mean, this is really fantastic. And those are units that are inherently more affordable because they're smaller. They don't involve all of the additional floor area that traditional building standards require. So cities can and should start to experiment with this, of course, making sure that they're sticking to the highest fire standards, but also the state government can act. So a little bit of background here on building codes. So building codes in the US and a couple other, like, American Samoa or I think Qatar, we use kind of a unique building code system that's written by an international nonprofit group. And then these codes are then adopted at the state level. But it's very common for state governments to actually amend these building codes, maybe to reflect local conditions or to reflect local safety considerations or to reflect local building typologies. So of course, local governments can do this, but ideally we would like to see more reform happen at the state level. So this has of course been the playbook for reform for the past 5 years, the YIMBY movement that's questioning a lot of the inherited institutions we have today. The California State Building Standards Commission really could look at some of these rules and say, how can we get the balance right here where we don't necessarily mandate these wasteful 5/1 floor plates, but we're not really compromising on fire safety. So, I think we're really workshopping what this is going to look like. And this is hopefully something that, we'll really zero in on. Ed is, of course, leading on that effort and stair pilling a lot of people. So that's important. But I'm excited to see where this issue goes. I'll say a few more things. I want to reiterate, I think this is a really exciting research base. If you have to do a master's thesis or if you have to do research as part of your dissertation work, there is like shockingly little out there on building codes, especially from an affordable housing or an urbanism perspective. This is one of those things where you actually probably can't take a class on it in planning school, weirdly enough, but it's going to be a thing that you encounter a lot in practice, and it's an area where we need a lot of really good research. Actually, I'll just leave it there and we'll move forward. Thanks.
Thank you, Nolan. The International Building Code, I feel like, do other countries actually use it for the most part? Or is it like the World Series of baseball where it's actually just the US?
Nigeria uses
Okay, okay.
Nigeria, Shane, come on, man.
All right. I don't want to leave
I
out
think
Nigeria.
it's like Dubai or some small.
Okay. Alex, Councilmember Fish,
Thank you.
please. Or Councilmember Aaron Fish, should I say? It's an inside joke. I had to get his name
Yeah,
wrong.
we're even. Yeah, I probably am the least qualified person to speak on this, but but I have my perspective, and you know, I think one thing that does qualify me is that Culver City is named after Harry Culver, who was a developer, and he I once uncovered one of his how to do development like guidebooks from 1917 or something when the city was founded, and it became clear reading it that he was one of the pioneers of what has become greenfield development. He, you know, pioneered the subdivision and platting and marketing, realizing that you could create a you know, product, that the single family neighborhood is a product. And he was very intimately involved with the early days of the National Realtors Board, and I may have mangled the name, but you know, so he was not just a developer, not just the founder of the city. He was really a pioneer for sort of mass production of what has become master plan communities. And you know, I kind of feel an obligation 100 years later to explore how we can produce housing in California en masse again, because that's really the problem that we have, is that even with work from home or whatever comes next, you know, it's really not tolerable to extend greenfield development further in California. The idea of, you know, the sand megalopolis, San Diego to San Francisco, is a horrifying nightmare to most people, and it's obviously climate you know, arson. You know, you just cannot have, we have to start reducing vehicle miles traveled. You know, I don't know how many times I have to say this. This is probably a place where, you know, people know it and you know, realize the imperative, but I've been saying it for 4 years and I'm still am having trouble getting it out into the popular consciousness. But you know, you look at the combination of state laws that apply at the regional level, and it's very clear that we are done with the greenfield development, with the blue top and all that stuff. So how do you turn KB Homes, Toll Brothers, all these different you know, housing mass producers into some, how do you produce a viable product for them? And I think that this, you know, that really small lot production is the only hope. That's, you know, that's the big picture, but you know, that touches so many other things in how we build our cities, what's legal in our cities, and where people live and what their lives are like. And this is a point where I also have to give the shout out to Mike Eliason and his firm Larch Labs, which you should Google larchlabs.com to see their stuff. Look at Michael's Twitter feed and absolutely read his articles on Tree Hugger and other places. He has had he, along with another architect, Gerhard Mayer, who's got some work in Common Edge, have really helped me think about American cities in a different way. You know, traveling certainly helps too. When you see neighborhoods that have, you know, 10 times the density of an outlying suburb, of a fifth ring suburb, that are quieter and yet have, you know, mixed income, what they call mixité in France, that I'd never encountered, that just the idea of a diversity of uses in your neighborhood, you know, what makes a neighborhood nice. You know, it's the rest of the world has this. It's not just Europe, obviously, but you know, Michael's writing on what needs to change to make great neighborhoods in North America really opened my eyes. And what's exciting about single point stair reform is that it is so simple. Like it's a win. We're talking about, you know, talking to the fire chief and getting him or her on board with you know, a different approach. That's obviously that's difficult. Anything that's different is hard to get done, especially when you're talking about safety, public safety, and that sort of thing. But this is, in terms of, you know, compared to zoning, compared to single family zoning and California's abolition of it, this is an easy fight. So it's kind of exciting. I think it should be the next thing, because when I look at what the 8 to 80, what cradle to grave city, what are we not offering people? It's the type of living that this makes possible, because we build two things. There are developers that everybody thinks about, right, who are building the giant 5/1s that everyone says that they hate, but still rent for astronomical sums and have very low vacancy. Or you have the big dumb box in the neighborhood, right? You have developers who knock down old single family houses and build very large new single family houses. Nobody seems to like any of them except for the consumer. The revealed preferences show that there's plenty of demand for that. But in between that, you think about, if you're a family in Culver City, a young family who wants to take advantage of the schools and doesn't have $3 or $4 million to buy a newly redeveloped house, doesn't have the time and inclination to do the stupid thing that I did, which is buy an old busted house and refurbish it over years and years and breathe all the lead and stuff. There's nothing really good. That 5/1 building is not really likely to have a lot of three bedroom apartments. It's not likely to feel like a neighborhood for people. Whereas, having traveled the world, these types of buildings, which are the workhorse of housing people everywhere else, we are outliers. Eliminating this type of affordable building that creates community. Absolutely. Who wouldn't want to raise a family in a building like this, where you've got the shared staircase that's in our sitcoms, but not in our cities? So I am super excited about this, and I don't want to drone on, but the other thing, having that, the 2 points I want to make on that having this type of building, which is possible to build and have it be immediately affordable on a small footprint, you allow those families to stay close to great jobs and great schools. And it is a pathway to reduced vehicle miles traveled, when you're not forcing people out to the deep suburbs to try and, to drive until you qualify, which is no longer even possible in California. Where would you drive to? California City? It's just not plausible. We need these types of structures. We need these types of whole neighborhoods, and we need them. Another point of Michael Eliason's, we need them on more than arterials. Obviously, that's the political easy fight. It's AB 2011. But we have to think about how we can have entire neighborhoods that are just like the rest of the world, because that's the climate solution, it's the affordability solution. And also, when you're making these types of buildings possible, and you make them possible to produce en masse, trying to tie it all together here, you then create all that value that's available for labor, and it's available for affordability. So, that's great in terms of building and housing tomorrow's middle class, which is not something California has cared about for a long time. And it's also great for the climate, as I mentioned, and it also affirmatively furthers fair housing, which 52 years into that project has only gone backwards in the last 40 years. So I think this next round of reforms, I am so glad that we're basically through zoning. I mean, it's still a live issue in the election. Who knows if I'll be back here as a city council member ever again, but because I have taken on the zoning fight, but I'm glad it's in the rearview mirror, because it is so emotional for people. But now we can start to, with these types of building code reforms, we can start to show what's possible, that there's something between the big dumb box that costs $250 million and the big dumb box that costs $2.5 million. And the final point I wanted to make about that is that, the key part, the reason I say it can't just be on arterials is that, there's a American political emotional aspect to this, and then there's a critical environmental justice part, which is, Americans think of apartment buildings as protecting their neighborhoods, right, where they live in single family homes. But everything I've just said means that these buildings are for everybody, right? And so we need to protect the occupants of these buildings as well. They should not be on our car sewers. They should be, people should be able to live with clean air. And we should, by rethinking what a neighborhood can be, starting small and creating wonderful places that people will want to replicate, we can start to eliminate some of that anti-apartment dweller bias, which has been in a part of our ethos ever since, what's the case, Euclid v. Ambler, which is right in there with the thing, calling apartment buildings a parasite. The buildings that you saw there, those were not parasites. Those are beautiful buildings, and they're, like I said, the workhorse of the rest of the world. So with that, I will turn it back to Shane.
Thank you, Councilmember Fish. And we've got about 20 minutes for questions and conversation here. I wanted to follow up first with just a question about kind of the path forward and safety in particular. I think Emily's chart on the rate of fire deaths in the US is pretty compelling as a case that like the way we're doing things now is not particularly safe. But it's very easy to imagine that if this is proposed, people like the building and safety department, like the fire department, you know, maybe they can't make a strong case that two stairs is safer than one, but stairs are a safety mechanism of some kind. And so I can see them saying, well, you know, how could it be better? How could it be more safe? It's got to be at least a little bit less safe. And safety is sort of the highest priority for everyone in a city, or it should be, but also especially for building and safety and the fire department. So how do we get them on board? Because it seems like if they can get on board, then we're golden. Who wants to take that?
Sounds like a politics question.
Probably, yes.
So
At least in part.
yeah, I mean, state level reform would make it fairly easy, right? The political pressures at the state level are a lot different than the local level. At the risk of saying something incredibly obvious, you really just, you know, the state level, you need to bring major interest groups along. And that's really it. And so, and there's the resources at the state level to have that sort of education of the interest groups. And this is not a emotional or, you know, it's not an emotional issue. And the only money involved that interest groups would care about is really more construction. So there's a lot of alignment for getting this sort of thing done at the state level, which I hope happens next year. At the city level, you know, this idea that we could have a more stringent building code with the stairs and have additional, you know, fire treatment, additional, you know, whatever it takes to have, stepping back, for the city itself to have to relax this standard and say that there only needs to be one staircase. My understanding is that the net effect has to be an increase in safety. If your building code is more stringent, then you can enact something. If it's less, if it's perceived as less, then you know, you're precluded, you're preempted by state law. So at the city level, it's a lot harder because you're dealing with a fire chief who's going to be, you know, small c conservative. They don't want to make a mistake. So, you know, a larger city would have an easier time with that, but larger cities are harder to move. So, you know, while in Culver City, I've been talking about this a little bit and trying to get some budgeting, and at the regional level with the Council of Governments and Southern California Association of Governments, I've been trying to get some investment in this research. It's much harder to get people comfortable, I think. So I'd like to learn how Seattle did it.
Yeah. We do actually have a question about the reforms in Seattle and New York, which I think could be useful. Does anyone know when those reforms took place, just to have a sense?
Seattle was 1971, I believe.
Okay.
And New York was a little bit earlier.
So 1971 in Seattle and actually earlier in New York City. So they've had these rules for a very long time. They're not like recent changes that we still don't know what the impacts are going to be. Okay. Do we know how fire safety compares in those cities?
I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah, I see Mike Eliason here. It says Seattle single stair proposal dates from the 1970s. Yeah, this actually kind of is some of this conversation is reminding me of Fire District 1 here in Los Angeles, which is a roughly 100-year-old regulation that restricts certain types of wood construction, mostly in downtown and in parts of Hollywood. It has been proposed actually to expand it because of some very confusing arguments about wildfires and maybe the Palmer building in downtown that burned down during construction, which is an entirely different matter from buildings that burned down after being completed. But these sort of zombie regulations that at one point served maybe a useful purpose. You could imagine Los Angeles in 1900 passing this law when it was very common for entire neighborhoods, if not entire cities, to burn down because of what they were built out of, because we had, didn't have the same preventive measures, the fire department wasn't there, all those things. And then they transform over time from this thing that is doing something positive to actually an impediment to other important goals that we have, and it isn't achieving the thing that it did in the first place. I don't really have a question with that comment, but I am curious, maybe to take this beyond single stair reform, because it sort of feels like this is an obvious thing. Like we just need to get enough people on board to support it and maybe get some legislators on board. But what else should we be thinking about with building codes or these other kind of fixes that we maybe haven't been giving as much attention? And Emily, feel free to chime in as well if you have other thoughts on this.
Well, I'll start really quickly. I mean, I come at this from having thought a lot about zoning. And in zoning, I think there were a lot of rules that were treated as obvious, that were treated as necessary, standards that just emerge and become the assumed required way of doing things. The 5,000 square foot lot, the 25-foot front setback, the 1 parking space per unit. These things have a way of just settling in and becoming inherited knowledge based on very, very little, if anything, right? I mean, I think when the Department of City Planning for LA did that study on the fire district expansion area, they couldn't even figure out why the fire district was adopted in the first place.
So that was something that stood out to me, was they couldn't actually say what spurred its creation, but they were considering expanding it nonetheless.
Yeah. I mean, so, I would say there's, we shouldn't always assume that just because rules have been on the books for a long time that they actually have a solid basis, or that they don't require critical reevaluation as building technology improves. The other thing I would just say is, egress provisions are for when everything else in building code regulation has failed. Buildings don't burn down very often, in part because we have pretty robust building regulation rules that prevent fires from spreading through buildings, right? Building materials, compartmentalization. We do 1,000 things in the US. Sprinklers, which that also, I don't want to rip the Band-Aid off on that, but sprinkler mandates can also get a little silly. But we do 1,000 other things such that buildings very rarely burn down. Most of the times when you see a building burning down in the US, it's a building that's under construction, and a lot of the elements that would have prevented that fire from getting out of control had not been put in place. So, I would say, I don't think anyone doubts that the fire regulation is absolutely crucial. I think the question is, what's the best way to actually achieve that? And if we strengthen some of these provisions in our building code that make sure that fires very rarely take root or spread, then the need to depend on extreme and costly and onerous egress mandates diminishes. And I would say too, there's an educational process to this, right? I think you do have to, this could involve a change in process for folks who are involved in firefighting, and they're the experts on that. And hopefully they'll lead on this, and we can talk about how to make sure that these things happen safely. Of course, in places like Germany, Austria, Switzerland, where this is the housing stock, they've developed mechanisms to make sure that, as we saw from Emily's fantastic charts, fire deaths and fire injuries are extremely minimal. So we know there's a better way of doing it. I think the question is how to get there.
Anyone else? Emily?
Yeah, I'll just also point to Stephen Smith, who tweets at Market Urbanism, another fantastic resource on building standards across countries. The second egress requirement in the US and Canada permeates apartment construction in lots of ways that are not simple to address discreetly. So much of our multifamily construction in the US is out of light wood, whereas in other countries, a lot of multifamily construction is made up out of concrete or masonry materials that burn much less and much more slowly. But under the second egress requirement, there's no incentive or no opportunity to substitute more expensive but slower burning materials as one component of safety for in exchange for having only one interior staircase, for example. So all of these requirements and the industry itself result in complicated calculations that lead to the outcomes we see today.
I think we had a question from someone in the audience. Was there? Oh no, it was a question over voice here. That one is very detailed. Was it David? I don't know if I can give anyone the authority to answer questions over here. I'm sorry. I don't have as many questions prepared as I would have liked because Pavo organized this and he had to leave at the last minute. So I'm filling in. This is like there's so few questions to ask because it's such a simple thing. We should just do it and move on with our lives, right? We had a question over here though. Yeah.
It overlaps a lot with what we do. So but I was just thinking kind of the same thing, that like this seems like one of those problems like with some zoning reform, doing criminal justice, where you have kind of dispersed benefits and then like concentrated costs, so it can be hard to kind of push things through. And so like one of the things I've heard Nolan talk about that I think is interesting on zoning was like in Texas, where sometimes there's a little bit of like a strategic compromise to say like, we'll let you still keep some single family zoning, but that has to be the exception, that you convince everybody. So I'm kind of curious if there's if any of you all see any pathways like that here, where like to kind of find creative solutions. No one's gonna want to like lower the risk of fire, like death at all. Like even like the citizens, I think, separate from just like an individual fire chief. So like whether it's like some of the things Emily was talking about there, where like maybe there's trade-offs that could, but you get cost calculations.
So just in case the folks can't hear, the question is basically, if we have to make a trade essentially for reducing the stair requirements, what is something maybe that could be added to, offset even just perceived increase in fire risk or danger from fire, even if there's not really evidence that removing a stair will increase fire risk, like just politically, is there anything we should be thinking about? And maybe just something that like actually would increase fire safety and reduce risk of dying or being injured in a fire, such that like it might be a good idea to do that thing anyway. Something that this mentioned another comparison, but I think like with criminal justice, when someone it makes me think of when like the prison release type policies, where like it is good from a criminal justice perspective to allow people to kind of reintegrate into society, but no governor or whatever wants to be in the position where they release someone from prison over a weekend or whatever, and then they go and murder someone or something like that. It can be an incredibly rare event, but like one fire is all it will take in a single stair building for this to come tumbling down potentially. So like, how do we address that concern?
Conrad Specker is in the Zoom chat, and he points to a couple of features from Seattle where they have increased fire rating of doors and pressurization of stairwells to help compensate for having only the single egress.
And I would just add, to the extent it is a political problem, because you're right, it's the gotcha, right? That oh, you did this, and a bunch of nuns died because of it. I think it really is. There's this American exceptionalism that manifests in bad ways sometimes, right? And one of them is that we feel like we have to reinvent everything that everyone else in the world does. This is a great opportunity to just go, do a survey. Like that's why I would love to see the legislature tackle it, to devote the resources to look around the world, take all the best practices, and make the safest buildings possible.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you do this right, you could remove this onerous mandate that doesn't really seem to have a connection to health and safety, and probably reduce fire risk, right? You can add in additional provisions that make buildings even safer, that are quite cheap and that don't block the type of infill multifamily we need. I would say too, I mean, just to tease, I think the broader conversation here is, I would like to see this be the start of a broader rethink of how we approach building code rules. I think we have to look at what peers abroad are doing. I think exactly as Alex said, we tend to be a little myopic on some of this stuff and try to reinvent the wheel here. We can learn from peers, especially as a state like California. We have to do more density, more infill. Places in Europe and Asia do that quite well, and we have a lot of lessons to be learned there. And I'm always hearing of small little elements of the building code where builders say, hey, if you could change these 2 or 3 words or these 2 or 3 sentences, we could build structures that have absolutely no safety compromise, but get more infill units built. So I think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit in this space, even beyond egress and core reform.
Yeah, and I'll just be like the 3rd or 4th person to give a shout out to Mike Eliason and Larch Labs, just for those kind of more architectural questions, which is not our focus today, but obviously the code, particulars really matter, and the architecture and design itself. And he has done just so much work on that. So anyone interested in kind of reading further into the technical details, that is the place to go. We're just about done here. Any closing comments anyone wants to part with here?
I'll just add, it is exciting to be at the point in discussing housing and affordable housing and city, design where we're in the weeds like this, because, talking about zoning the last few years, talking about parking has been awful, but there's such huge barriers that now we can get to the really, the low hanging fruit. It's all possible now.
Yeah. It wouldn't matter much if we had done this reform, but you still couldn't build multifamily housing anywhere. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm really excited that we're
that on?
finally venturing into.
There you go.
Yep. No, yeah, I'm really, really excited that we're getting to building code. I'm already tired of planning stuff.
Yeah, I would say in one sense, the housing situation has never been bleaker. California housing prices are hitting records. Rent burden rates are at historic highs. You can't really walk around LA without seeing desperate folks living under overpasses and intents. The silver lining of that is that people are looking for solutions. Everybody knows the status quo is broken on a whole bunch of different margins. That's the only way that at California YIMBY we're able to pass pretty radical bills liberalizing exclusionary zoning rules. And I think there's a huge appetite for reform. I think this is one of those moments where now's the time to start uncovering a lot of these small fixes, and people really want to hear them. They want to see them. And I'll just stress again, I think building codes is really a fantastic research space to be into. We have a lot of questions that we don't have answers for. And so certainly as some of you all who are doing masters or dissertations, I would nudge you to consider this, and you might even get a job out of it, because building codes are like zoning, where if you're one of like 10 wonky people in a given city who actually understand it, you can get a job out of it. And also make sure that a lot of people have access to affordable, decent housing within walking distance of daily needs. So thanks again for coming out.
Thank you, everyone.
All right. I think we'll call it. Thank you so much for coming out today in person, online. We really appreciate it. And take this message to your planning commissioner or your city council. Thank you.